Welcome to episode 74 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent writing crime fiction inspired by true crime FBI cases. We get to speak to retired agent and doctor Raymond Batvinis, Ph.D., who served in the FBI for 25 years. He spent most of his career concentrating on counterintelligence and counterterrorism matters. In this episode, Ray Batvinis reviews the history of the FBI's counterintelligence program and past and current investigations of Russian interference in U.S. policies. During his bureau career, Ray Batvinis' assignments included stints at the Washington field office and the Intelligence Division's training unit at FBI headquarters. Later, he served in the Baltimore Division as a supervisory special agent of a foreign counterintelligence squad where he was privileged to supervise espionage investigations. After his retirement, he earned a Ph.D. in American history from the Catholic University of America and currently works as a historian and educator specializing in the discipline of counterintelligence as a function of statecraft. He has written 2 books on the history of the FBI's counterintelligence program. The Origins of FBI Counterintelligence examines the turbulent early years of the Bureau's counterintelligence evolution and includes examples of past Russian interference. His latest book provides details about former Director J. Edgar Hoover and FBI counterintelligence during World War II. In addition to writing and research, Ray Batvinis operates FBIstudies.com, a website focused on the study of the FBI and other counterintelligence issues. Now, for those of you who are a regular listener of FBI Retired Case File Review, you know that I started this podcast as a way of giving listeners an insight into the FBI other than how the FBI is portrayed in books, on TV, and in movies. But I had no idea when I started this that the FBI would become embroiled in a political election that would eventually have the public questioning the FBI's integrity. So at some point, it became a mission of mine to make sure that people had an opportunity to listen to FBI agents talk about their cases, because no matter what anybody says, the FBI are those FBI agents and employees who work on cases every day. Those employees are not affected by what happens at those higher leadership levels. And my efforts seem to be working. I got this email the other day from Sarah, who said, "Thank you so much for your podcast. I didn't really know what to think about Bob Mueller and his investigation. I was worried about outside influence, especially after the firing of Mr. Comey. After binging on your podcast, I am so relieved. The integrity, focus, and commitment to pursuing the truth displayed by the agents you have interviewed has put that worry to rest. I am fully confident that Mueller and his team of agents will find the truth." Sarah's email made me determined that this podcast episode would be apolitical. But there's so much in the news about the special counsel and about Director Comey being fired. I just knew that you had to be curious as I was, about what those agents who are working on this investigation, this counterintelligence investigation concerning Russian interference in the 2016 election, what those journeyman level agents back on that counterintelligence squad in the Washington field office or at headquarters, what they're doing. I can tell you one thing, they're not watching the news. Why should they? They've got the facts. Just the facts, ma'am. Now, of course, I think that Ray Batvinis and I did an excellent job of just stating those facts. Just remember, my intentions are good. Before we get to the interview, I just want to thank you again for your support. For those of you who have picked up a copy of my FBI crime thriller, Pay to Play, about a female FBI agent investigating corruption in the Philadelphia strip club industry, which was inspired by an actual FBI investigation, I say thank you. Remember, when you pick up a copy of Pay to Play for yourself or as a gift for someone you know loves crime fiction, you're helping to defray the cost for me to produce ad-free content on a weekly basis. Thank you. Now here's the show. I am very happy to introduce my guest today, Dr. Ray Batvinis. Hi, Ray. How are you?
How are you, Jerry?
I'm good. Should I call you Ray or should I call you Dr. Batvinis?
No, I prefer you simply call me Ray.
Oh, great. Thank you. Yeah, we're on a first name basis usually here. As former colleagues, we never met, but once you're an FBI agent, you're a friend to all agents.
Exactly right. You're in the family.
Yes, in the family. All right, so the reason I am so excited, and I really am excited, I have done a lot of interviews already on the show on espionage and counterintelligence. We've reviewed cases. And the reason that's so fascinating, and you know this, is because those are our opportunities to really learn about the FBI's counterintelligence program. Because otherwise, if those cases don't get to court and become public, we have no idea what's happening behind, those closed doors.
Exactly.
Why don't you go ahead and tell the listeners about your background and, how you got to the point you are now where you are an expert in the history of the FBI's counterintelligence program.
I'm a native of Long Island, New York, born and raised, and went to Iona College in New Rochelle, graduated in 1968, received a master's degree from Catholic University in 1970 in history and political science. I was in the probation and parole service before I joined the FBI, and I joined on July 17th, 1972, as a special agent, and that's a very unique date in the history of the FBI. In fact, one of the most unique dates, because it was I was in the very first class with the first two women in the FBI.
Oh.
One was Joanne Pierce, who was actually a former Roman Catholic nun, and the other was Susan Rowley, who was a former U.S. Marine. I went into the FBI with the idea that I was going to do a conventional FBI criminal work, and as life has it, I did some, but not a great deal over the next 25 years. I spent almost the entire 25 years, as we sort of jokingly refer to it, on the dark side, where it's working counterintelligence, primarily Soviet Eastern European counterintelligence operations against, obviously, the Soviet Union's KGB and GRU, as well as their satellite services. I also did counterterrorism work. When I retired from the FBI, I retired, fortunately, at the age of 51 with 25 years of service. I got my PhD in history at Catholic University, and my dissertation evolved into my first book, which was called The Origins of the FBI's Counterintelligence Program, and it takes a very deep look into the history of the FBI's CIA program, how it evolved, how it developed, how it began. And then I also wrote a second book, which came out 3 years ago, called Hoover's Secret War Against Axis Spies, which takes a look at the history of the FBI's counterespionage and foreign intelligence operations against the Axis during the Second World War. Since my retirement in 1997, I've done a variety of things, primarily teach, consult, travel, research, I was called back to the FBI after I retired in the wake of 9/11 to participate and lead a tiger team of CIA officers and agents in training FBI agents in counterintelligence matters along the lines of the basic course. In the wake of the end of the Cold War, the FBI, quite frankly, had let its counterintelligence program go kind of moribund. And when 9/11 occurred, the reality was that they had to go back and reinvigorate it, and I was honored to be part of that. I've taught a great deal on the college level. Right now, I teach at the George Washington University. I'm a professional, what is called a professional instructor. I teach in the Department of History, and I teach undergraduates, and I teach basically a history of the FBI's counterintelligence program. It's a very popular course. My course is always filled to the max every semester. Kids are hungry to learn this stuff. What we teach, and it's all open source, but the reality is that this is not being taught on the college level. It's not being taught on the graduate level. So I feel very honored that I'm able to fill this gap. I continue to write. I continue to research. I'm working on another book right now, a biography, and I also serve as the historian for the Society of Former Special Agents of the FBI. So I have a pretty full plate as I sit here and talk to you.
I know you teach at the college level, but there are some people who have no idea what foreign counterintelligence is. So if you could go from the very basics and kind of explain what you're talking about.
Sure. Counterintelligence, I give my students the definition right off the bat when we first meet. And I really draw from the President Reagan's executive order. And it's very simple. It's simply information gathered and activities conducted to prevent espionage, sabotage, terrorism, political assassination, and other intelligence activities. That is the basic definition. That is what an FBI agent who is working counterintelligence and counterterrorism does every single day of his or her life. And where it gets confusing is, how do you do it? Okay? And there are an infinite number of ways in which this is done. It's done on a human level. That is to say, I am an FBI agent, and I'm going out and I'm trying to develop human sources who can provide me with a continuous flow of the highest level intelligence information about my adversary's espionage activities against my country. And I do it technically. I'll do it either through microphones, or I'll do it through wiretaps, or today penetration of your cellular phone and everything that your phone can provide to me, information, for example, like Snapchat or your Facebook account. Anything that helps give me a profile of you, so that it would make it easier for me to recruit you either as a source or subsequently maybe have to sit down with you and interrogate you and get you to give a confession. Today, in a world that we live in today, was not the world that I grew up in. Today, we live in a world where people live on that internet, and they live on that that cellular device that they have, and they give away so much about themselves to the FBI. And I want to make it very clear that the FBI just doesn't simply do this. In other words, we just don't go out and say we're going to go after this individual. There are some very serious and restrictive policies that the FBI has to follow. We have to get warrants. We have to be able to build up probable cause. I don't want to suggest that the FBI does this willy-nilly. It doesn't. But when it has the proper authority, when it has the proper warrants, it can develop a remarkable profile on the individual that it's pursuing for whatever reason, whether it's counterespionage or whether it's counterterrorism.
Can you go through the differences, because I understand that there is, between how you would go about doing that for a criminal investigation and the additional guidelines when it comes to a foreign counterintelligence investigation?
There are really two sets of guidelines. There are criminal investigative guidelines and then foreign counterintelligence guidelines.
Why? Why are there two?
Because of the fact that very often information comes to the FBI not through traditional criminal sources. We may get information, for example, from a national security agency intercept in another country. Or we may get information from another country, a friendly country, or perhaps not so friendly country that perhaps for whatever reason wants to give us this information, feels obliged to give us this information, and they have a source. And that information, they want to hold that information. It may be an intelligence source. So it would be handled as a counterintelligence matter, and it would be covered under the foreign counterintelligence guidelines.
So on everybody's mind right now, of course, is the FBI's investigation of Russian interference in the 2016 political campaign. And we are not going to get political here. I think one of the things that people have enjoyed about this podcast is that I follow, our guidelines as FBI agents, and, I don't get political. So we don't, we want to avoid that. But I do think that people would be fascinated as to exactly what, the FBI agents who are involved in this case, what they're doing. What is it that they're doing on an everyday basis? Could you share that with us?
Well, I can speculate. What they're doing primarily is they are attempting to. I'm not, and keep in mind, I'm not a technical person. They are attempting to identify the individuals who did the actual hacking, number one. And they're also attempting to develop linkages between those hackers and the Russian government, if there is, in fact, a linkage, so to speak. They're conducting interviews on a day-to-day basis. They're working with foreign partners. For example, they're working with the British. They're working with the Canadians to get their assistance in this. And what the goal of this is to determine, and I suspect it already has taken place, to determine if, in fact, this was a hacking that was done by a group of independent hackers, or was this an organized conspiratorial initiative started and fomented at the top of the Russian government in order to impact the U.S. electoral process. And that is the thrust of the investigation right now as we speak. I think there's also possible, I've not seen evidence of this, but I've seen innuendo in the press that there is an effort to determine if there is a linkage between the Russian government hacking and Trump administration officials or Trump officials during the campaign. I don't know. I'm not making any value judgments but I've read about this. But there is an effort to determine, did the Russians make an effort to alter the electoral vote in this country in favor of Donald Trump?
All right, so I have two questions.
Yeah.
One is, what is the objective? I know for a criminal case, the objective is to have somebody charged, and if they're found guilty, to send them to jail. What would be the objective in this case for the foreign party
right.
involved?
In this case, in this particular case, the objective is to get to the truth of the matter, to the extent that you can, to get as close as we can get to the truth of the matter, so that the United States, the Bureau, can produce a report that can be presented to the leadership of the Congress, to the House and the Senate leadership, as well as the President, in order for our government to take appropriate action against the Russian government for initiating these actions. And number two, and perhaps more importantly, to develop countermeasures to prevent this from happening again.
But we can assume that whatever is found out, nobody from the Russian government is going to jail. That's not the objective, I understand?
It is highly unlikely that anyone from the Russian government is going to spend any time in an American jail. I mean, it's not to say that, for example, charges couldn't be brought against some high-level Russian government employee or Russian government official if we can develop that kind of information. But the reality is that Russian official will never, ever step foot in the United States. And, of course, the Russian government will never turn him over to the United States. That could happen. Absolutely. But the odds of it are so remote that they would, in fact, they're so remote that they're non-existent that Putin would even think about turning over someone who was a hacker and was doing this at the bidding of the government.
All right, but any American person that may have been involved, any collusion, what would happen to that American person? Well,
if it was an American, and we could reach that American, okay. Let's say, for example, now we have charges against Edward Snowden, but we can't reach Snowden. The Russians are not going to give Snowden up. But if the American is, for example, here in the United States, or he's in a country which we have extradition proceedings or extradition agreements with that country, he or she will be brought back to the United States to face charges.
So in the examples, we have had the opportunity to speak with the case agents, say in the Robert Hansen case or the Rick Ames case and a number of others. We were able to see the results of that counterintelligence investigation. But there are few and in between, cases that become public. So could you give us kind of a historical review of cases and, of course you're not going to be able to name names, but situations where we have had success stories that the American public has never heard about? If you could give us some examples of the type of things that the FBI and the intelligence community would consider a success that the public would never know about.
Well, one of the cases that I always refer my students to is a case that's called Operation Solo, and I don't know if you're aware of that case.
No, I don't think I've heard about it.
So Operation Solo was a case, and it is such an enormous case. It involved two immigrants to the United States. One, It was Jack and Morris Childs. Now, this goes back years, okay? I'm being clear, but it's a perfect example. Morris Childs and Jack were brothers, and they were both from the Ukraine, and they immigrated to the United States with their mother, and then her father followed later on at the turn of the century. Jack Morris joined the American Communist Party. He was active in the party. He was active in the party until the late 1940s when he was expelled from the party. He was a senior member of the party. And he was expelled from the party. And the FBI, like I pointed out right in the beginning of our conversation, we're going out, we're talking to people, we're trying to develop sources. Jack and Morris had both, actually Morris had been expelled. The Bureau went and talked to Morris, and Morris agreed to cooperate with the FBI. But Morris was out of the party then. So through the Bureau and through Morris's efforts, Morris got back into the party. And that would have been an interesting story in and of itself, except that throughout the latter part of the 1950s, and this is where it gets complicated, Morris, 1950s, 1960s, and up until 1970s, Morris was making regular, secret, top secret trips into Moscow for the FBI. And the Russians believed that Morris was their guy. And he was providing the Bureau and, of course, the United States, the President, and people like Henry Kissinger, he was providing them with insights that no other human being could provide. He had personal one-on-one interaction with the leaders of the Politburo. He was one of the very first individuals to explain to the Western policymakers, that what we believed to have been a Soviet monolith, in other words, the Soviet Union and China as this monolithic partnership, he says that's nonsense. They hate each other. And of course, initially we didn't believe it. He was the very first individual to inform the Warren Commission that, in point of fact, the Soviet Union had nothing to do with the assassination of John F. Kennedy. He provided enormously powerful insights into the relations between the Soviet Union and its satellites. In fact, one author points out that, in fact, it was Morris Childs who opened the door for Richard Nixon to make his initial approach to China, knowing that Mao Zedong would agree to the start of a rapprochement between the two countries, and in effect create a deeper wedge between Mao and the leaders of the Politburo. So these are just some of the remarkable stories that the Bureau has as far as sources are concerned and stories are concerned.
Wow. Yeah, I don't think I'm aware of that at all. But, it's pretty fascinating. So who would be operating this particular source? Would it just... Mm-hmm.
The source would be people just like you and me, Jerry. I mean, people, FBI agents who are trained in counterintelligence, FBI agents who have a keen interest in it, FBI agents who are working the street and are sensitive to the development of sources, development of the human condition. In this case, the case was originally run by an FBI agent, a very modest, unassuming agent in Chicago by the name of Carl Fryman, who befriended Morris and convinced Morris to cooperate. It was later taken over by another FBI agent by the name of Walter Boyle, people whose names are lost to history. But these are the individuals who worked the case. We have to get this out of our minds that because he was such an important source, that he was handled by somebody at a very high level. That's not the case.
Well, that is fascinating because are the agents who are handling him, are they getting some direction from the intelligence community?
Yes, they are. They're getting questions, of course, because we keep in mind they're not necessarily subject matter experts. They may be very knowledgeable, but they're getting questions, and they are asking Morris these questions, and they're asking Jack these questions as well, and Morris and Jack are filling in the gaps, and the gaps that they're filling in are just absolutely amazing. And it goes back to what I originally said. Morris, and to a lesser extent Jack, but Morris from 1957 until 1977 provided our country, now think about all the presidents in between. Think about all the national security advisors in between. Think about all the CIA directors in between. Provided our political and defense and foreign policy leadership with a continuing flow of the highest grade information that any source could conceivably provide. He knew everything about what the Politburo was thinking. He knew their individual foibles. He knew their fears. He knew that they were terrified of a nuclear war. He knew all of these things. And he was able to provide this information to the President of the United States on a regular basis. Those are the kinds of sources that the FBI has been able to develop over the years. Not strictly in counterintelligence either. We're also talking about on the criminal side of the house. If you remember, you were, I'm sure, in the Bureau when Joe Pistone was in the Bureau.
Absolutely. We've interviewed him on the podcast already.
Yeah, and I mean, if you go, and I would suspect if you go back and you look at Joe's interview, it would track almost identically with what I'm talking about here on the CI side of the house with regard to Morris and Jack Childs.
Well, let me ask you this. Yeah, let me ask you this, because in saying that, then, we can assume that presently that the FBI probably has that same type of source information, one-on-one relationship, intelligence gathering with someone or some bodies who are telling us about Russian interference in the 2016 political election.
I would have to say that. I would absolutely have to say that. Somebody at a very high level who has a motive to keep the FBI and the intelligence community apprised of what is going on. Exactly.
Well, let's talk about that motive. When you have somebody that is a spy, either a spy for the United States or somebody an American citizen who's spying for a foreign country against the United States, let's talk about some of those motivations. Your
listeners should always keep in mind, for just as a starting point, sort of a simple starting point, is the term MICE. MICE, money, ideology, compromise, ego. And it can be any one of those. It can be a combination of those. It could be something that one can't even get a handle on. I've just finished a wonderful book, and to be very frank with you, I've forgotten her name, but it's called Spies in the Family, and it's the story of the CIA officer who handled Dmitry Polyakov. And Polyakov was known as the Cardinal of the Kremlin. And the FBI recruited Polyakov in the early 60s. And when he was a young officer, I think he was a captain, and he remained in the Soviet GRU, Soviet Military Intelligence, for the next 20 or so years, 25 years, and he had various assignments outside the outside of Moscow. I think he was in Indonesia, Jakarta, Indonesia. He was in India for a period. But his rank kept increasing to the point where he became a lieutenant general. I wouldn't swear to that. Definitely a general. So as his rank increased, his access increased. And but in the end, I think if you were to sit down with a CIA officer or an FBI analyst, we would have trouble figuring out what his motivation was. Except maybe he hated communism. He hated what it was doing to the Russian people, but no one really can get a handle on what his motivation is. Sometimes it's very simple. Sometimes it's money. We've had situations where an intelligence officer has cooperated with us with the promise of a better life for their children in the West. We've had them cooperate because their child has a particular disease or a particular medical problem. We've had them cooperate for any number of reasons. And, of course, you're always interested in the motivation. But sometimes the motivation takes sort of a lesser priority based on the information that they are providing. So the motivation can be all over the place. I know I had one where he provided certain information but wouldn't provide all information, which gave us reason to be concerned. But the information he was providing to us was priceless, which led us to conclude that this guy is not being directed, because we firmly believed that their service would never give up this kind of information, much like the situation with Hansen. I mean, the KGB didn't know who Hansen was, but they quickly assumed that this guy was not being directed because they knew that the Americans would never give up that kind of information.
Yeah, in his particular case, a number of Soviet double agents were executed.
Absolutely correct. Yeah, that's right. Uh-huh.
So the American government isn't going to, put in that type of information to trick anybody if they know that it's going to result in somebody's death. Is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is that, if you're running from the American side, if you're running a double agent, you've got to be careful about the information that you're giving up, because conceivably you could be giving up such good information that the other side knows this is a double agent, but the information's so good, they're still going to continue to run.
It sounds like a big game sometimes.
There's an element of gamesmanship to it. There's no question about it. I'd be less than honest if I said differently. But it's a balancing act. And you don't go into this stuff lightly. You and I both have been into business. You don't go into it lightly. You have to be very, very cautious, because there are human lives at stake. And you have to constantly be sensitive to just that.
Well, I would imagine that this whole spy thing, started during war. The enemy was trying to find out, what, the other side was doing and what kind of weapons and how many, soldiers they had. But in a time of, quote unquote, peace, what is the continued purpose of spying against each other? What are some of those reasons and purposes?
I don't know the exact quote. I'm sure I'll get into trouble with this. But peace is really just war by another name. Okay? And you have to be developing your agents, developing a good espionage regime or a good espionage apparatus against a country, even though you're not necessarily at war. This was the problem, going back to the interwar period between the First and the Second World War. The United States had no foreign intelligence service. The British, from their part, they fought a successful war again, successful. They won it. I mean, it was a Pyrrhic victory given all the losses that they had. But they failed to develop an adequate intelligence capability against the Germans in the 20 years leading up to the Second World War. So, but they were at peace. So when the war broke out in September of 1939, essentially the British were blind and deaf to when in fact they could have been really developing a very robust intelligence capability. And then there's the other factor: you don't know who your enemy is going to be. For example, and I go back, for example, to the first Gulf War. No one expected Saddam Hussein to invade Kuwait. So when he invaded Kuwait, people say, well, okay, what source coverage do we have? We don't have very much source coverage at all, because we've been directed in other areas by our political masses. That's not an excuse. That's a reality, you see. So you don't know who your enemy is going to be. You don't know who your adversary is going to be. And if you don't know who your adversary is going to be, where are you going to put your intelligence resources? Like right now, I'm sure U.S. intelligence resources are going against North Korea. They're going against Iran. They're going against Russia. They're going against China. But who's to say another country might not emerge in the next year, which we haven't been paying attention to, which has been under the radar? And now suddenly our political masters are saying we need source coverage on them. It doesn't happen overnight. You have to be developing these sources over a long period of time in order to obtain quality sources. There's a great line. I don't know if you've ever read John Masterman's book called The Double Cross System. He was one of the British leaders of the famous Double Cross system against the Germans. He was a member of MI5. And he said, you just don't conjure quality sources up from the vasty deep. You've got to spend time. You've got to spend energy. You've got to spend effort into developing sources so that when all of a sudden the balloon goes up and that you need these sources, you have them ready to go.
Wow. I have another question because, having worked, criminal investigations for 26 years when I was with the FBI, I got gratification. I was able to open a case and take it to the conclusion and, clap my hands together saying, job well done. But it sounds like in the counterintelligence world, you may spend your whole career just watching, just looking, just maintaining sources, and there is no, even though you know that there is a success that's happening just because you are in the know, there's no clear conclusion of your case, of your investigation. And I'm fascinated by this, how those agents, how you, as an FBI agent working in that field, how you dealt with that?
It's a good question, and I'm not sure I have an adequate answer for you. I mean, you knew what you had to do. You knew the importance of the work that you were doing, and you knew that the work that you were doing. It wasn't. I don't want to. When we talk about counterintelligence work, I always like to when I talk to my students about counterintelligence work, I don't necessarily like sports metaphors, but I use a football metaphor, and I said a foreign intelligence service is like the offensive the offense on a football team. They have one purpose and one purpose only, and that's to score points, put points up on the board. And I'll ask my students, I said, what is the purpose of the defense? And they'll say to me, invariably, it's to prevent the enemy, the offense from scoring. And I'll look at them and go, is that really their only job? I said, how many times How many times do you see a cornerback or a free safety or a linebacker grab the ball out of the offensive hand and run it in for the touchdown? So the counterintelligence service has a twofold job. It has a job, yes, to prevent, but it also has a job to score points. And by scoring points, I mean developing those sources, like I've just described for you, the Morris Childs case. They were very important foreign intelligence sources and counterintelligence sources. Where it gets difficult is it's a long, lengthy process. If you're a person who needs immediate, short-term gratification, it's not the job for you. If you are satisfied, if getting your gratification, your professional gratification over a longer period of time, and where you see it on the criminal side of the house, and I use this as my example to them, particularly on organized crime. When you are if you're going after organized crime figures, you don't just get them in every 6 months or every 8 months. If you went after a John Gotti, for example, or a Vito Genovese, okay, or one of these major kingpins, it takes years to be able to build a case because they know you're out there and they are doing everything they can to prevent you from getting to them. So there are a lot of parallels. In fact, I've always argued that some of the best agents who work counterintelligence come out of organized crime because they have what I would call the patience, the ability to sort of stay with a case and to develop the case over a long period of time. So that's how you get your gratification. I always say that if you had to judge my career by the number of arrests I've made, I had a terrible career because I didn't make a lot of arrests. But I had a wonderfully gratifying career because of what we were doing behind the scenes and the information that we were developing. And we knew how important this information that we were developing was to our National Command Authority at that particular time.
Fascinating. Well, my next question is, you talk about offense and defense, and that's basically still watching, what they're doing, what we're doing, what do they know about what we're doing, what do we know about what they're doing. But I think the scary thing from what I'm hearing about the Russian interference in our political system and their interference in other countries' political systems is the purpose, the objective seems to be this destabilization of, our way of governing, our way of doing things. Has that always been an active part of foreign intelligence, or is this something new?
No, it's always been a part of Soviet and its predecessor, Russian intelligence.
Can you give me an example of how that's been?
Sure. Yeah, I can tell you during the Tsarist period. If you remember the book that was written, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, that was a book that was a monograph that was prepared by the Tsarist government to, in effect, impugn the Jewish race and the Jewish religion. That in fact it was Jews who were responsible for international revolution. When the Soviets took over, they simply called it active measures. One of the most horrific and unconscionable active measures, and this was believed in the third world, was that American couples who had children, and children, for example, who needed an organ transplant, that they were in effect buying babies in the third world and having those babies murdered and having their body parts, a liver, a kidney, a lung, whatever, harvested and secretly brought to the United States and transplanted into their child to keep their child alive.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, there are others. There were we know, for example, that the Russians were not behind the assassination of John F. Kennedy. They had nothing to do with it, but that doesn't mean they didn't exploit it. We know, for example, that they attempted to engage in an active measure which tried to convince the third world that, in point of fact, the CIA was behind the assassination of John Kennedy. They produced excellent forgeries of Lee Harvey Oswald's signature. That even Marina Oswald was fooled. She believed it was her husband's signature. So this is not new at all. I'm trying to think of another one that. And when we were battling with them during the Cold War for influence in the third world, they were engaged in active measures to convince the third world that the AIDS virus was actually created right here at Fort Detrick, which was the Army's medical research division. AIDS was created there, and it was intentionally spread throughout the third world and in Africa in order to decimate Africans. So, I mean, this is nothing new. So the only thing that seems to be new is the scale of it and the audacity of it. That is new. But as far as active measures are concerned, the Russians are very adept at this, and I have every reason to believe that this comes right from Vladimir Putin. I mean, I have no proof. I'm on the outside. I read the same things that everybody else reads, try to keep myself informed, but I have every reason to believe that what we're seeing here comes directly from the orders of the highest levels of the Kremlin. No question.
So this information that's being spread is purposely to create what it has created right now, the divisiveness, this divided nation. Sounds like it is a direct objective of the Russian government.
You're absolutely right. I mean, what they want to do is they want to create doubt and suspicion among the American public about the legitimacy of their government and the truthfulness and the honesty of their government. This is what they're trying to do. I mean, it's frightening. It really is frightening.
And they've been successful then, I would say. They must be sitting back, in old Mother Russia, patting themselves on the back because there is doubt on both sides.
Well, that's right. I agree with you. I think I was watching Jim Clapper. He came back up to Congress. He was invited after the Trump administration had come in, and you could just see he was asked for his views, and General Clapper, I mean, he was just shaking his head, rubbing his head and saying, I don't know, but we've got to do something about this, to send some kind of a message to Putin to get him to back off on this. But because in my opinion, there is no doubt that he, and I'm not getting political here at all. I think another factor here, when this first started, I think he absolutely loathes Hillary Clinton. I think it was personal on his part too. And I want to make it clear, I'm not talking as a Republican or a Democrat, not at all. I'm talking as somebody who did this work for all those years. I'm on the outside and I'm looking at it. And I think between he and Clinton, it was personal. And I've written on this in my blog. I pointed out that this is not me saying this. There's a wonderful book that was written by and I'm sorry I can't give you the name of the author, I don't remember, but it's called Alter Egos. And the book was written during the campaign, and it was a careful examination of the relationship between President Obama and Hillary Clinton when she was the Secretary of State.
Mm-hmm.
And in one, of course, everyone is familiar with when she went to, I think, Moscow State University, and she was making comments about the electoral system in Moscow, in Russia, and how basically how fraudulent it is. But what she did, not then, I don't know exactly when, she basically equated Putin to Hitler. And you and I, we may just say, well, okay, we can blow that off. You have to bear in mind, when you go back and you look at Putin's life, Putin's father fought on the Eastern Front against Hitler's forces and was grievously wounded. He never really recovered after the war was over. And number two, Putin's mother survived the siege of Leningrad, the 600-day siege of Leningrad. And while she was there, she literally had her, as it turns out, it was Putin's older brother, her son died in her arms of diphtheria because there were no medical supplies. There was no food. These people starved to death. So when you have an American politician, equating the head of the Russian government, calling the Russian government I don't know. I mean, I can't think of anything more horrendous. And again, I want to emphasize to your listeners that I'm not making any political statement here, but you were talking to me originally about motivations.
Yeah.
This could conceivably be a motivation. It could be purely personal. It started out that way, and then maybe it turned into a massive active measure that worked very well for them.
Can you think, as a historian, of any other time in our history where a foreign leader has taken a personal vendetta against the United States?
A personal vendetta against the United...
Yeah, as in this case.
I'm perhaps if I had more time, but no, I can't think of any. I can't think of any.
So these are strange times.
They are. They are, and it gives you a sense, frankly, of the absolute power that Putin holds in Russia today. This can be allowed to take place.
Well, let me ask you the last question, because I think it's a loaded question. I was with the FBI 7 years after 9/11, and I was there. I saw the FBI transition from what was mostly known as a law enforcement agency into an intelligence agency. And I saw so many other resources that we use for criminal cases go to terrorism and foreign counterintelligence. And now I'm not sure if I were to walk back into an FBI office, if I would recognize how the office runs. And what do you think about the FBI as it operates today? Do you see it moving more and more into security of our nation through terrorism and foreign counterintelligence? Do you see the need to continue to be a criminal law enforcement, especially when it comes to things like public corruption and organized crime and those areas? As the FBI historian for the Society of Former Special Agents of the FBI, I'd love to hear your viewpoint on that.
I had a chance some years ago to ask this very question of Jim Comey.
Oh.
And I said to him, do you look upon yourself now, today, as a criminal? And I forget exactly how I phrased it. Basically, I said, the FBI today has gone from being a criminal investigative organization with national security responsibilities into the largest, most powerful, most recognized, and we're talking in a Western sense. We're not talking China, we're not talking Russia, but we're talking about, in a free world, the largest, most powerful national security organization with criminal investigative responsibilities as well. And he said, you're absolutely right. The preponderance of resources in the FBI today are going to counterterrorism, cyber terrorism, counterintelligence, and on down to what you and I call conventional criminal investigative responsibilities. And I believe that's the way it should be. I believe we should never go back. I believe that some of the traditional investigations that we had, we can realign those to other organizations within the government. For example, the Marshal Service can handle fugitives, but we still retain the right to go after certain fugitives if we want. But there are certain investigations, to be frank, that only the FBI can handle. And I cannot see us. I would be saddened by the fact that someone would want us to go back the other way. I think it's far too important at this stage in the development of our country not to have a robust, aggressive counter security service, because that's what we are. The Bureau is a security service along the lines in the mind of CSIS up in Canada or the British Security Service, MI5. But the beauty is we also have criminal investigations as well. Jerry can be working a counterintelligence case, a major counterintelligence case, and all of a sudden we find that there is a criminal investigative component to it. We don't have to give it to another agency. We can simply take that particular case and run that case, and by satisfactorily completing that criminal case, we may be able to roll up the entire counterintelligence aspect to it as well.
Well, I will say that, I agree with you. You're absolutely right. But I am nostalgic, for the FBI as it used to be. And that's why I feel absolutely blessed and honored that I have agents from, all over the country who've worked a variety of different violations who are willing to share their FBI stories with me, because those stories soon will be stories in the past and not the stories of the FBI's future.
That's exactly right. It is the FBI does so many different things. That's what the American public doesn't quite grasp. It does in New York City. It may be doing Russian organized crime. Out in the far west, it may be doing matters relating to Indian reservations. It may be doing matters relating to, who knows, shale oil. Who knows? You see, wherever it happens to be on the southwest border has a different set of situations. The South has a different situation. It does a great deal, but the reality is that today, more than ever, the American public should take confidence in the fact that the Federal Bureau. I've done a lot of traveling overseas over the years, and and not because of Ray Batvinis, but when people talk, say Ray was with the FBI, it's like Ray walks on water. Well, Ray doesn't walk on water. Okay? In other words, it's the Bureau, really, the reputation of the Bureau that carries it. And it's even more so today when you go back and you look at the Charlie Hebdo, what happened at Charlie Hebdo. When you look at what happened at the concert in Paris where all those people were killed, or in Belgium, the Bureau is the first one on the ground over there, providing support, providing information about what we have, developing information. And we can never, ever go back to what it was. I agree with you. I'm very nostalgic for the past, but the past is the past. We have to go, we have to move forward. And I don't think there's an agency in the government that's moving forward faster than the Bureau.
I agree. Well, we're just about running out of time, so I want to make sure that you've had the opportunity. You have such a vast knowledge of the Bureau, of counterintelligence, And, we could probably talk for another hour. So I do want to make sure that I give you the last opportunity to say whatever you need to say, to share whatever you think that the listeners would need to know as we end our conversation.
I think the way I would end it is, and again, I'm speaking as an American. I'm not speaking as a Republican or a Democrat, but this whole issue with regard to Comey and his being fired, and the whole issue with regard to Mueller and as the special counsel, I think the American public should feel very confident, go to bed at night completely confident that the FBI doesn't even blink. The FBI is going to follow this investigation regardless of who the president is, regardless of who the special counsel or Comey's termination. The FBI is going to follow every single lead wherever it goes, and it's after the truth. And in the end, it'll be the Bureau which doesn't leave a stone unturned and will let all the chips fall where they may.
And that's the end of the interview. As always, back at jerrywilliams.com, you'll find photos of Ray Batvinis. You'll find links to his website, FBIstudies.com, and his book, The Origins of FBI Counterintelligence. You'll also find a link to the FBI website where you can learn more about the FBI Counterintelligence program. If you enjoyed the interview, I hope you share it with your friends, family, and associates. I make it easy for you. At the bottom of the episode show notes, you'll find all the social media share buttons. And of course, if you're listening to this interview using a podcast app, you can share it directly from your phone. At this point of the episode, I usually share a crime fiction or crime thriller recommendation with you. However, this week I am on my way to Thriller Fest, which is the world's biggest conference for thriller, mystery, and crime fiction writers. So I'll be looking out for some really good books at the conference, hopefully featuring FBI agents. I do want to remind you that if you're interested in reading books about the FBI written by FBI agents, you want to go to my website and become a part of my FBI reader team, where I'll share with you the FBI reading resource. It's a list of all of the books written by the FBI agents featured on this podcast. When you get to my website, jerrywilliams.com, all you'll need to do is sign up when you see the pop-up. This episode was sponsored by FBIRetired.com, the only online directory made available to the general public featuring retired FBI agents and analysts interested in showcasing their skills to secure business opportunities. I want to thank you for listening, and I hope you come back again for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.